Hi everyone, this is Miss Simmons again. I just wanted to start my third video, and I forgot in the second one to talk about the arsenal of democracy. So let's start with that. During World War II and the home front, the United States was considered to be the quote unquote arsenal of democracy. If something is an arsenal, it means that it creates weapons, it creates materials used for war. It's really kind of the support for the war being able to go on. And even before Pearl Harbor, we pretty much were acting as an arsenal for at least Great Britain with our policies like cash and carry and the Lend-Lease policy and the Destroy Us for Basis deal. We're going to continue that role because we really are not fighting the war at home directly. We are supporting the war, and we're not just supporting our troops, we're supporting especially the British troops during the war effort. So, in these images, you can see some examples of how the United States was the arsenal of democracy. On the left-hand side, right here, you have essentially Uncle Sam, who's looking like he's ready to go settle a score. He's rolling up his sleeves. He's got all these weapons of war behind him, anything from ships back here to trucks to tanks to airplanes being shot off. And think about that term, arsenal of democracy. The fact that we're not just building weapons of war, we're doing it for the purpose of trying to keep democracy within the world. Notice here on this particular advertisement, it says 24 hours a day and 7 days a week is hardly enough time to supply the war materials for democracy's defense. As part of the arsenal for democracy, we're seeing major factories that otherwise would have produced cars or produced other things turning themselves completely over to supporting the war effort by totally changing what they produced and how much they produced, and really try to get people to work around the clock to supply the weapons of war. In this next image, you see some African American women working as riveters, and they're building parts of a ship or part of an airplane as these women are creating and working in an industry that prior to this really had only been open to men. Here's another woman over here on the right. She's building bombs and calibrating those bombs and making sure that they are ready to detonate when needed during the war. So that idea that we're supplying the weapons of war, but we're doing so to help save democracy and spread democracy around the world is really kind of the idea behind our involvement in World War II. And you can think about how that also relates specifically to in World War I, where Woodrow Wilson says we're going to get involved in this war to quote unquote make the world safe for democracy. We also see some examples of Japanese internment. So arsenal democracy is really kind of on the positive end of what we're doing during this war effort. Now we're going to see specifically how the war impacts other people who are living within the United States. So getting back to that particular notion of how we're impacting different groups, Japanese Americans are most definitely going to be impacted during World War II. Japanese internment takes place between 1942 and 1946. The rationale behind Japanese internment was that many people felt incorrectly that if Japan were to attack on our West Coast, that Japanese Americans would not support the United States. They would turn and start to attack the United States in loyalty to where they came from and loyalty to their homeland. And it's based on this misassumption with no evidence whatsoever that this in fact was the case, that Executive Order 9066 is passed by FDR. And unfortunately, this image is a little bit blurry, but what this shows you is essentially where Japanese Americans are taken from and placed into internment camps. So on this western half of the United States, notice we've got the Mississippi River right here. All of this is happening west of the Mississippi. This dark bolded line shows you the area from which Japanese Americans are removed from their homes. This is the exclusion area. And they're taken to, in many cases, these places that are black triangles on this map. These are the relocation centers, or that's essentially what the internment camps are called during World War II. In total, approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans are forcibly removed from the West Coast in this particular region. About 10,000 of them are sent to other locations, and about 110,000 of them are sent to these internment camps, where they're going to be held, denying them all civil rights from 1942 until 1946. 62% of those forced to move were US citizens. It's lasting from the spring of 1942 until 1946. And most Japanese Americans were prepared to support the war. In fact, we have Japanese Americans who fought and won medals of honor in fighting in World War II. They were not allowed to fight in the Pacific based on that same assumption that they would support the Japanese over Americans. But we do have very valiant efforts on Japanese veterans fighting in Europe during this time. You would, if you were Japanese American during this time, typically be given about 6 days to liquefy the things that you had, get rid of it, sell it, before you're forced into these internment camps, and adults were only allowed to take 2 suitcases each. Families were not separated. They were allowed to stay together in these internment camps. And one interesting thing about these internment camps in the Executive Order 9066 is that Hawaii, having the largest population of people of Japanese descent at the time, over 2/3 of the entire labor force in Hawaii was of Japanese descent. Most people of Japanese descent in Hawaii were allowed to just live and work in Hawaii. 1,500 Hawaiians were sent to locations outside of Hawaii. These were people of Japanese descent, but the vast majority of people of Japanese descent in Hawaii were allowed to stay there because their labor was considered to be vital. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans who had assets in banks, those assets were frozen and they did not have access to them until after the war. In this photograph, you see people, young boys interred in these Japanese internment camps. You can see the watchtower right here. You can also notice that the area that they're interred is essentially a deserted, isolated area. This is an area where you're not close to other segments of the population. People lived in barracks that were similar to military-style barracks. The camps were in remote, desolate areas. They're surrounded by barbed wire. There are searchlights to make sure people aren't trying to escape. Families are kept together. Guards, for the most part, do not interact very much with the Japanese Americans that are there. And one of the ways that people kind of kept their sanity is they started baseball leagues within these Japanese internment camps. You guys live close to DC. If you ever go down to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, they have a segment on Japanese internment, and there's even some things that you can touch and handle. And one of them is actually a baseball glove that was used by people who played baseball in these internment camps, if you go down there. One of the most famous cases to come out of Japanese internment is a Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States. It was decided in 1944. Here's a photograph of Fred Korematsu at the time. Here's a photograph of him in the 1990s winning the Congressional Medal of Honor. Fred Korematsu was 23 years old when the camps were established. He'd previously worked to support the war effort before the war started. If you remember, we have our first peacetime draft. We are supplying the British mostly with the cash and carry policy, the Lend-Lease policy, the destroy us for bases policy, and he actually worked in munitions plants supporting the war effort. When the Japanese internment Executive Order 9066 came down, he refused to move and actually went into hiding in Oakland, California. He sues the government with the help of the ACLU for this issue of Japanese internment. The case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided, here in red, you can see it, one group of citizens may be singled out and expelled from their homes for several years without trial, based solely on their ancestry in times of emergency and peril. So they decided against Fred Korematsu. Fred is going to have to be put into an internment camp for the duration of the war. In 1983, the Supreme Court overruled this decision based on the fact that they did not, the Supreme Court was not given evidence from the FBI that indicated that there was no evidence whatsoever to support the notion that the Japanese were, in fact, at all any threat to the United States. In 1988, Japanese who had been interned received $20,000 from the US government if they were still alive at that point in time from the Civil Liberties Act. And in 2010, Fred Korematsu, he had passed away by that point in time. The day, January 30th, was designated as Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and support of the Constitution. Interestingly enough, in much more recent history, in 2018, this case was cited in support of the Supreme Court deciding in Trump versus Hawaii that Trump, in fact, did have a right to ban people based on their home country in an effort to keep in times of emergency and peril, that the president had that prerogative. So it's kind of an interesting way that that case has come about. And I'm not sure within 15 minutes that I have time to talk about women. So I'm going to stop there. And my next video is going to talk specifically about women and the war, and also about the use of the atomic bomb in the war. Thank you guys. And I'll be talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.